Where would we be without light?
So you can then get creative with that and you can twist it.
I suppose you have to get real inspiration from what you're seeing out and about.
It's going to go a little bit deep here, guys.
This is the Learn, Create, Thrive podcast by visualeducation.com. Light, the most powerful tool you have.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Learn, Create, Thrive podcast. As usual, I'm with Tim Godion, creative director, artist, illustrator. Benjamin Toome, head of video production here at Visual Education, and Emma Harris, creative marketing genius is what we'll call you today.
Never been called a genius before.
Do I need to put that on the ticket?
Yeah, bring that up. And
Bring
myself,
it up every time.
Carl Taylor, photographer and director. Today's topic I'm very excited about because it's the importance of light. This is totally my area, totally the subject that I get very passionate and fanatical about. And I've got first on my list, why no one gets it. And the reason that's a little bit harsh, but the reason I've put that there is because so many creatives or new creatives, people that may be listening to this podcast, they don't at first understand the importance of light. They assume that almost everything in creativity, and I'm talking about visual arts here, of course, but they assume that everything is to do with the brush, the paint, the camera, the lens, the frame rate, the aperture, the depth of field, the tools. They give far much more precedent to those things than they do to the fundamentally most important thing in all visual art forms, which is light. Now, Tim, I think you'll even agree with me here as an artist and illustrator. I know you're not painting with light as such, but you're painting on visuals that were formed from light.
Yeah, I mean, you are kind of painting with light in effect, aren't you? Because you're creating a luminosity between the colours and the layers of colour and how it radiates out from the canvas or the paper that you paint on. So, in effect, you are. And the light and the style of lighting you use creates a kind of emotive feel and a vibe to the piece of artwork you're creating.
You're right, your contrast and luminosity levels, that's all to do with light.
Yeah.
So how the image is depicted and read is very important in that. And it's exactly the same in photography and cinematography, and we'll talk to Ben about that in a bit as well. But I want to go into a few things here. I want to go into a couple of, I suppose, philosophical and physiological things to do with light. I mean, it's going to go a little bit not random. It's going to go a little bit deep here, guys. What the hell is he talking about? But the fact is, right, where would we be without light? Now, that might sound, we wouldn't be able to take photos or this, that, and the other. But actually, everything in our existence evolves or revolves around light. If you think about the fuel that we're burning right now, it's derived from light, because fossil fuels is a process of decaying photosynthesis plants which had to rely on light to survive. Animals feed on plants that need light to generate energy and the sugars and everything else. Nearly everything in our world, from energy, even modern forms of energy, solar, etc., it all begins with that sunlight, with light from the sun.
From the first cell, really, isn't it?
Exactly.
In evolution.
Even that. And that's how important light is in our general world and being around us. Of course, as visual creatures, we need light to be able to see, and so do all other animals that rely on light. Some animals rely on different wavelengths of light, maybe more into ultraviolet, etc. But it's so undervalued or underappreciated, or maybe the word is it's just taken for granted. You know, you look around, don't really consider light. And that's the fundamental problem with new artists coming into visual arts, is not really appreciating the importance of light and its ability to depict mood and emotion, but in understanding how it does that, the physical components necessary, the actual physics behind it that are basically the regulators of the rules of light. There are rules with light that cannot be changed and broken because it is a physical property. A really important quote here from George Eastman. George Eastman was the founder of the Kodak Photographic Company. I'm sure even you Gen Z, Y, X's, whatever, would have heard of Kodak.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So Kodak was like the biggest photographic company in the world, formed 100 plus years ago by a gentleman, George Eastman, or his grandfather or something. And they made film for decades and decades, but they actually moved into digital sensors and other forms of image processing. They're still going today in one form or another. But George Eastman, he said, light makes photography. Embrace light, admire it, love it, but above all, know light. Know it for all you are worth, and you will then know the key to photography. It's not about lenses. It's not about, ISO and apertures and shutter speeds. Light is the fundamentally most important thing, and the same goes for cinematography as well. And the reason I get so hung up on this is because so many new photographers and cinematographers are focused. All you see the discussions, Ben, you'll know this, all they talk about is which camera was that on, which lens was it on, what focal length, what shutter speed, boom, boom, boom. And they assume the picture is good for all of those factors, when actually the recording device was the least most important part of the process.
That's just a tool, isn't it?
Just the tool.
You could have a box. Is it the box brown?
Box brown.
The kind of old camera, like the pinhole camera?
Yeah.
And you can capture an image, can't you?
Even the subject of the photo is almost like irrelevant if the lighting's bad, even if you're shooting something really cool or conceptual or anything like that, or a beautiful model or anything, landscape. If the light's bad, then it's a bad photo.
Exactly. You could have the most incredible, amazing supercar or superbike, or the best perfected dish of food, or the world's most amazing famous sculpture. Light it badly, you won't reveal the form, you won't reveal the shape, you won't reveal the art of the subject, and the image will be a failure because of light. And equally, if you take any subject, even something very mundane and boring, like a tomato, you could light it in an incredible way and it could still make an engaging photograph. Now, if you take an interesting subject and you build some narrative and a set and what have you, and then you light that in an amazing way, then you can create a really, really interesting and unique piece of work. But if you light the same subject badly, then of course it will look completely different. But if we analyze that in relation to equipment, this is where it's really interesting. We did that example, didn't we, where I lit a Harley Davidson motorbike, made it look amazing, shooting it on a 100 megapixel Hasselblad camera, and fantastic resolution, fantastic detail. But then we just took the same shot on the iPhone to prove that actually side by side the two shots looked very similar at low resolution, and it showed that it wasn't the iPhone that made the picture or the Hasselblad that made the picture, it was the lighting that made the picture. And at that low resolution, no one would really know which one shot the picture. Of course, the Hasselblad has got huge advantages when it comes to a bigger version of the image and better tonal range. But in terms of the initial appeal and impact of the image, it was all about the lighting on the subject. And that's what's absolutely crucial. And then there's more and more science involved that we're going to delve into a little bit more. First, Ben, you were a little bit quiet on one of our previous episodes of the podcast because I think you thought you were going to have to start making a show reel and finding your...
We're lucky he's back, aren't we?
We're lucky he's here. We thought his desk was going to be empty. If you missed that episode, that was, what was that on? Marketing. Yeah, that was kind of funny. Ben, storytelling in film, video, cinema, how important is lighting?
Yeah, you can. There's definitely, when you watch a movie and the lighting isn't good, it just has straight away. It's just got that like amateur look to it. Even if like the script is amazing or the actor's amazing, if it doesn't, if the lighting's bad, then it's like straight away. It's hard to, even if you don't know light, I think you still know when something's bad, and if the lighting's bad, then yeah, you would know it's bad. But like I think what like with like, you know, people that don't work in the creative arts or people that don't know about light is the actual like understanding of it. Like you see it like, you know, day to day, the sun shines down, but then you don't know like how that is then implemented into like movies and stuff. Like like I don't know, for example, like there's 2001 Space Odyssey. I think we've looked at that example before in previous content that we've made. There's like a famous scene at the end where it's lit from below and it looks really disorientating and like almost horror style because the whole floor is like the light basically. So it's kind of like knowing that light comes from above and comes down. And then also, yeah, if you were doing a horror scene, you would do it like that. So I think there's definitely... But
why are they doing it like that? Because it's an unnatural... position
because they wanted to
deliberately make it look unnatural,
and it's the same with like horror movies. If you light up, people look scarier, and it's a lot of people don't think. I don't think they know that. They just, like you said, take light for almost granted, and they don't consider where it comes from or how it's doing that or why it's creating that or it's giving that look or that emotion.
Yeah, but you're used to light. The most common light form is the sun, isn't it? So it's always coming from above.
Or the side.
But
like, never from below.
No. So you got the golden hour in the morning and the evening, you got this lovely warmth. So that gives you a feel-good like factor. Yeah, and then if you've got a movie as well, like kind of a romance scene and it's shot in the golden hour, that's gonna enhance that feel-good factor, isn't it? Whereas if it's... Obviously, if that scene was lit from underneath, it's not really going to go well with the kind of romance of the moment, is it?
Yeah.
Necessarily.
I think it's definitely something that needs to be understood to then be able to be utilised, you know?
Yes.
And that you need to just break down. Like we get a lot of people like, I really want to get the look of, they're doing a food shot and they want it to look like a nice afternoon sun coming in. But they're not thinking about if that was actually real, what would the light be?
Yes.
And they're trying to replicate that and they just they haven't got that concept of that grasp of, well, how did that happen in the first place if it was real?
Yeah, and you need to understand that, as Tim said, it all originates with our understanding, our innate understanding, instinctive understanding of natural light just through human experience, from a baby to an adult. You're seeing the sun come up every day as it has done for billions of years, but throughout the first 20 years of your life, for example, times 365 days a year, you've experienced that sun coming up, going down, arcing across the sky, and you're seeing that light change on different days, different cloud formations. And as Tim pointed out, when the sun's low in the sky on a clear day, it will be a lot warmer and more orange because it's cutting through more atmosphere. And that has a sort of nostalgic, romantic feel about it. And it also gives a vision of people lit in a slightly different way, warmer light, side lighting that can look quite flattering as opposed to a harsh midday light with dark shadows under the eyebrows and strong shadows that can be a bit too harsh for most photography and cinematography. But interestingly, this is all just based on the human experience. Because, for example, if you were a fish or a scallop or whatever underwater, your experience of light is completely different. You don't see the sunrise in the same way because you're below the surface of the water. So you have no connection whatsoever to what we're talking about. But other animals may experience light in the same way that we do and recognize it, but more for survival reasons. So our experience of light, and going back to what Ben was talking about with the scene from Space Odyssey 2001, is that we never see light coming up from underneath us. apart from a few rare situations where it might be bouncing off of the surface of a lake or water, but that's usually in combination with light from above as well. We never have in the natural world a situation where light is just emanating upwards at us. I suppose there might be the rarest of occasions you could be stood above the crater of a volcano that's burning very brightly, but in 99.9% of circumstances, and that therefore it's an unnatural situation, and that's why unnatural lighting situations are often used to depict unnatural or supernatural scenes.
I think there's also an element of like our sort of survival instinct as well. Like in a movie, they might make someone scary because you can't see their eyes. You know, it might be shadowed over their eyes, and then you don't trust them. And that's the same with like real life, I suppose. You want to make eye contact to see whether someone's a threat or not. So
absolutely,
it's used.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. We use shadows and dark areas in film and video and photography to depict drama and mystery and a little bit of fear, because it's the fear of the unknown, what's coming out at you in the dark. You can imagine that as we were growing up as cave people or Neanderthals wandering around the plains of Europe, the most fearful moments would be, wandering across a savannah in the dark, wondering what's lurking there for you, or sat around the campfire wondering what's lingering in the dark around there. And that survival instinct of what is scary to us and what isn't is carried through in our association with light today. And in many scenes of mystery, where they want to convey that sense of mystery or superstition, or those values of not supernatural in this case, but just elements of doubt, or what's another word for mystery?
So it's unease as
unease,
well.
yeah, tension,
That sort of,
tension. That's it, more that sort of thing. They'll often use just very small patches of light across a face, or just on parts of a body. Very often used as well in many music videos and those sort of things. But interestingly, those are all to do with depictions or reproductions of natural light scenarios. We can use natural light scenarios as well in a studio environment for very specific reasons. One that I like to use is dappled light. Dappled light is quite a pleasant experience. It's not the same sense you get from mystery of dark shadows, but it's that same association with light coming filtering through leaves on a tree, and it just being little small patches. It's got a sort of delicateness about it. And again, that is drawn from the real world. But colour, hugely important aspect of light. People might be listening going, colour, what's that got to do with light? Well, of course, it's got everything to do with light, because colour, light in itself, as we see it, daylight from the sun, if we split it through a prism, it's broken into its constituent wavelengths as specific colours. And using colour in our lighting as well has a huge bearing. I'll shut up talking in a minute because I'm doing a lot of talking, but giving you a great example. In many of my studio portraits, what I'll do is I will light with normal daylight colour. This is artificial light, but it's balanced to the same colour as daylight. And then in the shadows, I'll actually use a little bit of blue light. And the reason for that is that in the real world, if you are photographing a person under normal daylight, so either the sun is hitting them or the sun is hitting them through a cloud and the rest of the sky is blue, then the light that is striking them is called the key light. That's the most prominent light source, the one that is casting the shadows. The shadow is a blocking of the key light. Okay, so it means the key light has not been able to make a path to that area, and therefore it's formed a shadow. However, there is still light in the shadow. Where has it come from? It's not come from the key light. It's come from the surrounding ambient light, as we call it, and that is usually the sky, which is blue. Which is blue, yeah. So sometimes the light in the shadow may be a little bit cleaner and purer because your subject might be stood next to a white building and the reflection off of the white building is going into the shadows. But in an open air environment, standing on a white, flat salt lake bed, a person in direct sunlight, the shadows would have an appearance of blue, although in saying that, the light bouncing off the salt lake white bed would have an impression on it as well.
You've used other colours as well, haven't you? Because we did that fire shoot with the firemen.
Yes.
Didn't you put red in one side and blue the other?
Yes.
So it was sort of like the emergency services lights and the fire.
That's right, yeah. So sometimes to emulate what might be going on outside the picture.
Even if you can't actually see what's outside, it just gives you that impression of what's going on.
And there's subtle little changes that people don't necessarily notice directly when viewing the image, but subconsciously they do notice it. Little things like that. So when you're creating your lighting, it's a very good idea to be tuned in to what a scene might be in reality and what might be going on in a scene. And as you pointed out there, Emma, we put in a little edge of blue lighting that could simulate potentially the emergency services blue lights in the nearby surroundings.
I remember at the time, because I think I was assisting you on that, and I'm no photographer, but I was assisting, and I was like, what is he doing? Like, why is he getting me to get the blue gels out? And then you're like, you explained it, and I was like, that is actually genius. Like, you just wouldn't, like, but people don't think about that.
But it creates the feel, doesn't it, of the scene. The model, the scene actually on a real rescue or putting out a fire, because that's what you'd expect to see is some blue lights.
In movies they do it as well, like at night, you know, they not so much these days because cameras are better in low light, but they used to not be as good, so then they would film a scene in the day and then darken it down and then make it blue, you know, put a blue wash over it, so you instantly just feel like it's night, because that's what night looks like.
And one of the reasons that light does look like that at night, so what Ben was describing there in terms of a night scene and how it's perceived, often, especially in the old Western movies, they would basically suck all the colour out and add a little bit of blue in and darken it right down. Because if you were to film under a full moon and you had a camera capable of doing that nice and cleanly, or your vision, you can still see under the full moon when your eyes have adjusted. And let's say you were away from city lights and out in nature somewhere, you would actually start to see quite well. And what you would notice is that the moon actually casts strong shadows, sharp shadows, and that's because visually to us the moon is actually about the same size as the sun, which is why when we have a total eclipse, the moon moves in front of the sun and it's just the right size that the corona is visible. Millions and millions of years ago, the moon was bigger because it was closer to Earth, so it would have obscured the sun totally. But it just so happens at this moment in time, visually from Earth, it looks about the same size as the sun. Therefore, on a moonlit full moon night, the shadows are the same sharpness as you would have from the sun. They are the same defined. We'll talk about the edge shadows definition in a minute. So you have areas that have shadows with a strong defined edge, like a midday shadow. The difference is that the shadows are completely black because there is no blue light going into them, and that's why the shadows on a moonlit night actually look quite spooky, because you can't see anything in those shadows.
The darkness of the shadows.
Really dark. There's no bounce back.
Light,
no, because the light is so dim. Now, the light coming off the moon is actually very neutral. It's almost the same colour as the light from the sun, because the moon is kind of just a powdery grey white. But the reason we see it as a blue light is because we have two types of cells in our eyes, cone cells and rod cells. Now, cone cells, if you're familiar with photographic sensors, they use an RGB model, if you like, where we have red cone cells, a sort of greeny yellow one, and a blue. We're more receptive to yellow, which is why yellow looks far brighter than its actual luminosity value is in normal situations. But when we move into low light situations, our cone cells close down. They kind of shut down. They're used for high detail in the fovea, and they are really tightly packed in that area. And they give good color vision and very good resolution. But they're not very good in low light. Okay, they don't have the sensitivity to low light. But what does have the sensitivity to low light are the rod cells. And there's another type of cell in our eyes. And we have some in the central area, but the majority of them are spread out around the rest of the eye in what would be more your peripheral vision area. So what happens is that after 20 minutes or so, in the night, in the dark, out in the middle of nowhere on a full moon, your vision system would have switched mostly to your rod cells. And your rod cells are more sensitive to blue light. They don't have the ability to see red, green, or blue. And that's why at night, everything looks black and white in low light, but with a slight hint towards blue. And this is a really interesting experiment if you want to try it at home, is spend a little bit of time in a really dark room that you know has got some like coloured objects in it, like a red football or a whatever, or a red jumper and a green coat and this, that and the other, but hardly any light in the room. Wait till you can see, but you'll realise that you can no longer see the colour of the objects anymore. And we forget about this. We don't think about it. We actually kind of just accept it. And also, a lot of people don't spend that much time in very darkened situations. But you'll notice that your colour vision basically shuts down and it moves to an almost black and white vision. And hence, going back to what Ben was saying, this is why in films they use that technique to replicate that form of vision.
I do. When I'm painting and when I'm teaching painting, I often tell people as well to squint, like to nearly close your eyes, and then you just see everything like in grayscale. So I suppose it's a similar thing. You're not getting the full use of the cells within your eyes, but then you can just see things visually as darks and lights, and it's a really good way of getting a kind of broad composition idea of the composition. What's the darks and what's the lights?
Yeah, the tonal information. Yeah. So we call that high and low spatial frequency. And what that is that when we look through our eyelashes or a diffuse screen, we remove all the fine detail, and all that's left is blended tonal ranges. And actually in photography and post-production, we can separate those two frequencies, which is textural information, high detail, and separate it from low frequency information, which can be a useful retouch technique. But that's another topic of conversation. Tim, you paint in the shadows in different colours, don't you?
Yeah, so it was interesting hearing what you're saying about photography and film and light in the shadows and the blues, because I often use blues. I very rarely use black when I paint because I find it quite a cold, dead colour. It doesn't have much life to it. So I'll more often use a dark purples, but more likely blues, because the nice coolness of the blue, I might mix some other colours in or have some little flecks of some warmer colours with it. So then you get a play between one colour and the other and a bit of movement. And that there's, you're looking at it, I suppose, visually, your eyes looking at the different colours in those shadows, but it's much nicer and more interesting to use colour in the shadows, and blues are always a good colour because it's a cool colour, so the shadows feel right, if that makes sense in the painting when they're in a bluey kind of grey.
Yeah, people might not even be aware of it when they're viewing your painting, but
if you were in a strong colour in the shadows, you could use it very cleverly for creative reasons, but also often they just look wrong because they jump out. Like if you painted shadows orange, for instance, there's going to be a reason why they're orange.
Yeah, how is it exactly? How did they get to
that? Can be really cool as well, playing with colour and light in your picture. And it's like sometimes I might go a bit green on my skies or use green in sky because your brain automatically turns it to blue when it's viewing it, but it puts a bit of a trick, so it's a little bit more interesting. So it catches your eyes to start with and makes it a little more visually exciting to look at. So you can break the rules of colour and using light. And when I say like colour with paint, you're using like the colour almost as a light with the luminosity. And quite often, like in shadows and that, I might layer up 2 or 3 different translucent, semi-transparent layers of colour, so one can glow through and the light from the white of the canvas can kind of glow through them. So it's really interesting how that crosses over from the kind of photography side,
absolutely.
isn't it?
I mean, we're recording it or lighting it in that way, but you're having to recognize it in the real world scenarios and then paint it in that way.
Yeah, and that's where the sort of squinting and doing just a quick charcoal or black and white scribble, even with a biro, of just the tonal range of the light, what's the lightest points, what the darkest points, and the point of highest contrast, like the light, the white against black is the most high contrast you can get. You can use that as part of your composition, because that would be the kind of almost the part that catches your eye first, because it's got more contrast in the picture. And then certain colours as well can helpfully just put a few specks of the wrong colour in a certain area of the picture can also become a focal point, or just offsetting a complementary colour against a difference.
I suppose you have to get real inspiration from what you're seeing out and about. Like, I bet do you ever like go on walks and you're like, oh, I want to capture that sort of light through there? Or I don't know if you get that, Carl, as a photographer, that you're like, the way that light shines on that coffee cup, that would be an amazing way to light something in the studio.
Yeah, there's a valley that I drive through, like just near our offices here, like every day, all year, and it's got some lovely trees that kind of arch over the roadway, and you're kind of going through a big tunnel of light, really. And I think they're lime trees. They've got really beautiful sort of soft translucent leaves. You get that lovely dappled light, and even at the moment when it's coming into autumn here, the leaves just getting ready to fall, you've got that really nice kind of golden glow as you drive through that road, whereas in the springtime it's very fresh, bright, lemony kind of green
on the trees.
Light. Yeah, and then when you've got no leaves and a sort of more wintry, colder feel, it's quite interesting. It made me think as well a bit about there's a David Hockney did several years, did a video, like a time lapse of a certain area in the UK, and it wasn't really a time lapse, but he did a high resolution with a multicam set up just of a lane in England, and the different seasons, and kind of recorded that as a sort of art project, and how the light changes through the seasons,
comparing the seasons,
and then like showed the winter against the spring on the same location.
Well,
that's interesting.
Go for it, Ben.
It's like when you see the light coming through clouds, it looks so much more interesting, and you get those like light rays, and people then replicate that in photos and paintings and stuff, because it looks so much more interesting.
Yeah, the drama,
just flat.
When I paint landscapes, it's a lot of that. It's the drama. Like if I went to that location and it's just a grey day with dull light, it's flat, and it's very hard to make that painting exciting. I might then look at maybe using more texture or abstract-y shapes, but if you've got the light just popping through the clouds, kind of maybe spotlight in a certain area within the landscape.
Well, let's get into the physics of why light is flat, for example, in those situations. So I think you guys, having worked here for a long time, would by now have picked up the very basics of lighting. So what are the two most common terms that people learn in light?
Hard light and soft light.
There you go. See, they knew that. Hard light and soft light. Okay.
That's right. We've got one right there. We don't have to get the rest.
I'm just going to, in case the audience aren't familiar with this, I'm just going to very briefly explain. So soft light comes from any light source that is very large, and that's large to the subject. So, for example, a 6-inch light 2 inches away from an ant is a large light source. Okay, it's a small light source to us, but it's what it is from the subject's perspective. Okay, a small light source is any point light source. The sun can be considered a point light source because in the sky it's very small, and therefore it casts strong shadows. Point light sources cast strong, sharp shadows. Large, massive light sources, those that are large from the subject's perspective, don't cast any shadows, or a very, very soft, diffuse shadow. Now, our association with the lighting Tim was talking about, very flat, boring, dull, on overcast days, is because we have a blanket of cloud over our head running from horizon to horizon. The sun is obviously above it, but it's being diffused through this sheet of cloud, and the sheet of cloud just becomes one big, giant light source, making flat light with hardly any shadows. Take that layer of cloud away and you're left with the sun. You have strong, sharp shadows. So those are the two very basic fundamentals, hard and soft light. But there are thousands and thousands of permutations in between that, where we can actually have strong shadows and soft light at the same time. We can have a variation of slightly diffused hard light, the angle of the light, etc., etc. And as we change the size of a light source from a point light source and gradually make it bigger, the shadows change slightly. So a true point light source, one that comes from an infinitely small point, will cast the crispest, sharpest edge shadows possible. But as soon as that light source gets a little bit bigger, the edges will become a little bit less crisp. And then it gets to the size of the sun, and then they're sharp, but not actually critically sharp. And then as they get a little bit bigger, the shadows just get a little bit softer and softer. There are other physical properties that are slightly different as well, and that's to do with distance. So if you imagine yourself stood on a white, flat, matte white surface outside, midday sun, visualize yourself standing there in your shoes and your clothes or whatever. The sun is shining down and you're looking at your shadow on the floor, okay? What can you tell me about your shadow on the floor that you know from experience that is different? Anything?
It's going to be lighter because it's white.
It'll be, yes, the surface of the amount of light visible in your shadow will be lighter than it would on a darker surface because it's on a white background. But I'm actually talking about the shadow definition, the edge sharpness of the shadow. What do you notice about it?
It'd be quite defined because it's a small light source.
It is, yeah. But even finer detail than that is where the shadow is closer to your foot is sharper than it is where it is at your head. Because the way light works and the amount of visibility of the light source itself, less of it is visible at that closer area to the ground to your leg or calf muscle than it is from your head. So as we increase distance from the object, the shadow will change. Therefore, the palm tree that is 20 meters away and is 20 meters high, the shadows that is casting on the white floor next to you will not be pin sharp. They will be slightly softer around the edges, even though we're still dealing with a point light source. So the definition of the shadows is not only affected by the light source itself, but it's affected by the distance of the subject from the surface where the shadows is falling. And this is an important concept in photography as well. And then, of course, as we change the size of the light source, all of that changes dramatically as well. But we can actually have hard shadows and soft shadows at the same time. Even in the natural world, it's possible to have light coming through a cloud that is giving quite soft light, and then having a small cloud nearby that is directly in the path of the really bright sunlight, and the small cloud becomes a brighter cloud than the other one, and it actually becomes the key light. And you can end up with these weird situations. You might notice it when you're driving along, where a shadow of a car has got a sharp shadow, but it's also got a soft shadow. So there are many permutations. But this is the interesting thing as well, is when we talk about using light in photography and cinematography and art, we use hard light to reveal texture, okay? You can't reveal texture with flat light. And you can't reveal texture even with hard light if the light is perpendicular to the subject. So if I'm looking at Tim's craggy face right opposite me, and I put a hard light directly on him from my vision point, I won't really see too much texture because all the light will bounce straight back towards me. So for texture to be revealed, the hard light source needs to move around to the side. And then if it's a small light source, that texture will be very strong. So that's how you can depict texture.
And you could also use it to take a more flattering portrait or a more kind of character kind of craggy
exactly.
style.
But I'm staring at your face and trying to figure out what it look like with light.
Or to change the mood of the image.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But interestingly, if we were to take a large light source, like a really big softbox, and move it around to the side of Tim, If there was no reflector or no light source on the right side, we would still have strong shadows on the right side, but the texture on the left wouldn't be strong. Contrast would be there, but texture would not be the same. So there is a variation in that. And then there comes another point called the inverse square law, whereas if we move the light really close to Tim, the light will be softer, but the contrast will be greater because the fall off of intensity of the light will decrease and diminish more rapidly because of the inverse square law. And if we move the light further away, but it's all affected by the room you're working in, the size of the room, the bounce off of the walls, the color of the walls, and all these other various factors. Another really interesting thing that a lot of people don't know is if you light, let's say we had a red football. I'll use a football because they're kind of leathery and not gloss, not matte, right? So let's say you had a red football and a green football and a blue football in a pyramid shape, glued together. And we light them with a 150 octabox, 150 centimeter octabox from camera position just above, take the photo, and then we do the same but with a point light source, small light source, take the same photo. You've got the exposure exactly right on both. To your mind, naturally, which one will have the best colour?
The bigger source.
No.
I can't. I'm.
The reason is
this anymore.
That's to do with reflectivity. Okay, so when we use a large light source, the subject material that's receiving the light, if the light source is very big, it has the ability to reflect more of that light source directly as direct reflections because the angles of incidence are now enlarged. Whereas if we use the point light source, the angle of incidence is restricted and narrowed, and therefore we reflect less of the light source and more of the direct colour. So if you want to photograph something to be super, super colourful, then actually a hard light and a point light source will give you a more punchy colour, but it's a much more difficult light source to work with because the shadows will be darker and more strong.
If you want to get the best light and you're using artificial light as well, you'd have to take into consideration the CRI of the light that you're using as well.
Explain CRI then.
I was to say
colour something index. What is it?
Yes,
colour rendering index.
Colour rendering index. But explain to our audience what that means. What is it?
It's kind of like the quality of light.
Yeah, the purity.
Yeah.
I don't know the spectrum, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's like
spectrum.
if you film, like we've had it in the past where we've had no choice, but you've had to film something under, say, very low quality fluorescent lights in a kind of interior. They've got a real greeny orange, kind of quite a sickly look on people. The flesh tones and that look horrible
because they're missing
and you can't
parts of the spectrum.
Hardly even pull it back in post, can you? Because the colour isn't there in the first place. So.
Yeah, if you were filming under LEDs, even if they were daylight balance, because they're not, like just how LEDs in your house, they're not going to be high spectrum, high CRI lights. They're going to be cheaper, obviously, because they just need to light. They don't need to. Look
we don't
amazing.
Notice. We look at it, and if the light looks the right colour balance, we think it's okay. But where a light is missing a big part of the spectrum, photographically, it won't reproduce the colours with such accuracy. The colour fidelity goes right down. So even the very definitive physics of the actual light source itself, the spectrum of light that it's putting out, what we call full spectrum lighting, one of the best continuous light sources is HMI lighting, which kind of gone out of fashion now because LED lighting is a lot cheaper.
And
LED's got a lot. It's got a lot better now. The CRI on LED's running up at about 95 to 98 now, whereas HMI is like 100. But anyway, we're going off into another sort of aspect there of light source itself. But if we go back to using light and manipulating light, we have tons and tons of different modifiers in photography and cinematography. Now, a modifier is something that is used to do what it says, modify the light, okay? And essentially, the light itself in the modifier is coming from a point light source. It's coming from the bulb, the bare bulb or the flash tube from the studio light, which is relatively small, so we'll call it a point light source. And what the modifier does is spreads that light out or diffuses that light or does something with it. It modifies that light to make it give a different quality on the subject that it hits. Now, interestingly, this is where it goes beyond hard and soft light. A large light source, such as an Octabox 150, gives a very different light to an equivalent sized parabolic reflector. Now, even though they're both the same size, one will give soft light and the other will give soft light, but the light will look very, very different. And that's because of the direction of the light. When light is projected out of a modifier, if it takes a path that is parallel to the axis of symmetry, so it's like coming out of that modifier only in a straight line directly the direction of the modifier itself, then the way the light goes into the subject material is very, very different to how it would be with an Octabox. Now, for example, an Octabox, of course, light's going to come out of it forwards and hit your subject, but it's also hitting the subject from a diagonal from the one edge of the softbox to the other side of the subject, or from the other side of the softbox to the other side of the subject. But with parallel collimated light, we call it, if it's coming out of a parabolic reflector, or another famous type of lighting used in theatres, Fresnels, invented by Auguste Fresnel, the French physicist, I think, in 1980. I can't even remember now.
It's like you're getting a lighthouse, isn't it?
Yeah, the same type of modifier in a lighthouse.
So it's a beam that goes a long way.
It goes a long way, but it goes in a straight line, parallel to the axis of symmetry of the light source. So a Fresnel modifier, like a theatre light or a lighthouse light, is equivalent to a parabolic light. A parabolic modifier is actually a Fresnel in reverse. So it's reflecting the light rather than directing it through a stepped convex lens. But the effect of the light from collimated light is a really interesting in the way that it fills in creases and lines in people's faces, making it look very, very flattering, but equally as very high contrast, which contours the face really, really well. And that's why parabolic lighting is used primarily in fashion and beauty, because it reveals fantastic texture, but it's also soft at the same time. So one of the arguments, a lot of people say to me, well, if that's the case, why don't we just use like massive Fresnels rather than big parabolics? And the obvious reason is
they're massive.
They're massive. They're too heavy.
The glass
would be huge. We'd be talking like a lighthouse glass, which to move around in the studio
as well, wouldn't
exactly, it's impossible. Whereas a parabolic reflector is something that can be opened up, folded into shape, and as long as it is that true parabola shape with a focusing rod where the light can move in and out, then it gives a similar effect, a little bit softer as well. So there are fundamental ways of controlling light beyond hard and soft, also to do with direction of light.
And you can sign it like a theatre spotlight. You can have it going like through a lens. You can focus it
exactly,
like you do with your
projection
attachments.
Yeah.
So you can shine it through an element like a lens, and then modify it,
refocuses it,
or diffuse it that
way. And then you can create tiny slithers of light or patches of light. And equally to do with the way the light is directed out of the modifier, equally important is the distance you use the modifier from the subject has a huge bearing on the results of the subject. And this is really interesting because another great example where newbies or less experienced people might not realize is if you've been taught that hard light comes from a small light source, and the further away a light source is, the smaller it is, then of course it makes sense immediately that if you move the light source further away, the light is going to get harder. But in an enclosed white studio environment, that's actually not the case, because what happens is then the inverse square law takes over, and the amount of bounced light from around the studio becomes ever increasingly brighter because of the inverse square law, and you end up with a softer light. So the physics knowledge has to be applied with the environment in mind as well.
Yeah, because we get so many photographers who use a big softbox but they put it really far
Yes,
away.
yes.
And then they're like, what's going on?
Yeah,
I don't understand it.
it's a softbox. Why is it not soft?
It's because it's bouncing off
Yeah.
your little
Yeah.
spare room,
Or
all the
because
white
you've
walls.
used it 4 meters away from your subject.
It just doesn't
It's not soft
work.
when it's that far away. And that's why the phrase, the size of the light source apparent from the subject's
Yeah.
point of view is
Yeah.
so important. If it's not big from the subject's point of view, then it won't be soft, no matter how. I mean, the sun is a perfect example. The sun is considered a point small light source, but of course we know the sun's massive.
Yeah.
It's like 1,000 times the diameter of the Earth or more. I don't know. But if we were close to the sun, apart from burning to death, but if we were close to the sun and impervious to heat, it would be very soft light
Yeah.
because it was huge.
What I find as well really interesting is like when I've seen you doing shoots with some of the large soft boxes as well, you've got a large like 2 meter kind of square big area of light, but also you can then get creative with that and you can twist it. So the model is then, or the subject's only seeing a thin slit.
Yes,
so
exactly.
You can have one modifier, but use that in a multitude of ways quite
Yeah.
creatively by thinking outside the box.
Yes.
And I think as a sort of creative myself, the important thing with light is almost kind of having a concept for the image you want to create, isn't it? And then working out what mood, what feeling, what vibe do I want to get back from the image I'm looking to create, whether it's a painting, you're creating a movie or a still image. You can then work out, how can I modify the light? How can I create that feeling? How can I create that atmosphere? Do you know what I mean? Do I want white light? Do I want coloured lights? Do you know what I mean? Do I want one light? Do I want shadows all in one direction? Do I want to trick the eye by having shadows in different directions?
Yeah, and that's,
do I want to fill it in?
That understanding of that is what's key to mastering creating scenes in cinematography and photography. And it's interesting, the example you just gave about turning a large softbox so that from the subject's point of view, it becomes almost like a strip light.
Yeah.
Because from the subject's point of view, they're not seeing the front face anymore.
Yeah.
They're seeing like a diagonal, but
Yeah.
a very acute angle. So visibly, they're just seeing a stripe of light. But what's interesting about that is actually the light coming from it is that the bit that's closest to them is a lot brighter than the bit that is now further away. So you're actually getting a strip light that's a gradient as well. So there's another
and
whole nother
there was a
thing
really
in
interesting
that.
project you did, didn't you? We've got it on our website, a lighting modifier kind of tool where you shot a model with every different type of modifier.
Yes, yeah, and
it
that's-
shows
yeah.
It was very interesting seeing how the feel and the look of the model and the image and the vibe you got back off that, looking at the image, changed.
Yes.
Just depending on the modifier,
Yeah.
like whether it was a parabolic, like a beauty dish, a
Or
hard light,
point
a soft
light
light.
source, yeah.
Point
And
lights.
folks, that's a free tool that you can use on visualeducation.com in our resources tab on the menu. There's a one called the light modifier app.
Is it just
Oh,
called lighting
lighting
comparison?
Lighting
tool.
comparison tool.
Yeah.
So it's a free app that you can use where it demonstrates each type of lighting modifier in a fixed position, the same position on a model, full length and headshot. The important thing to recognize though with that is just from one particular fixed position. Of course, the light could have been used in 1,000 different positions, but it just gives a direct comparison of what each
Gives a good
modifier-
overview, eh?
Gives a good overview.
For modifiers, if you were looking
Yeah.
to purchase a modifier,
Yeah,
You're
it's
like, oh, I
an
really
idea.
want
Yeah,
that
you
sort
can
of
see
look.
how it
You
would
can-
look.
Gives you
in
an idea,
comparison,
what they can do. Now, Tim, let's touch base with you and with you, Ben, on this. Human association with colour. How colour can create emotion and different feelings of calm or warmth or cold, etc.
Yeah, well, it's like colour, like, so red is kind of like sort of anger or passion or sort of love or romance, isn't it? And then blue is kind of more cold. So you get a vibe off the colours, and that's what I was saying earlier, like sometimes putting an unusual colour in a painting or using a kind of limited palette can help create the mood of a picture immediately without doing anything else creatively, just that palette of colours, or it might just be an abstract of colour patterns and texture, and that will give you a feel just by looking at that. If it's reds, it's going to have a warmth to it, like I said, like romance or anger or
Nostalgia.
or passion, nostalgia, or sort of blues. It's going to have that more cold sort of sort of nighttime kind of esque feel, because that's how you're used to seeing the sort of landscape at night.
So kind of modern as well, you know, like if blue is more sort of sci-fi, isn't it? You don't really see many sci-fis that are like really warmly graded or like red. Except for like, you know, a few like.
And there's an artist that I really like, Edward Hopper, and he does a lot of kind of American style diners, but the way he paints, it's almost got a movie-esque style lighting. So it's really interesting how an artist has used more of a feel of a movie style lighting in his paintings, and it gives you that kind of nostalgia of the kind of Hollywood movies of that kind of same period, that cinematic feel. So how the different, using a lighting from one sort of genre and taking it into another genre can actually create a vibe or feel in your painting and be used creatively.
One of my favourite films from a lighting, well, it's a really good film anyway, but from a lighting perspective is the film Seven with Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt. The lighting in that as a dark, edgy, it's not a horror movie, thriller
I'd say it was,
thriller. The lighting control in that with shadows and patches of light and rain and dark tones, and the way the lighting in the library scene and all, it's just incredible lighting that helps carry that.
Do they use a lot of like turbidity and stuff in it as well? Is that
yes, absolutely. Turbidity,
that
definitely.
In movies is like massive, you know.
So turbidity, for those of our audience who don't understand that, is just essentially haziness in the air, or in water actually, but in the air. So for example, you might view a scene and you notice that the room looks quite smoky or hazy, and the reason for doing that is, one, it shows up light beams really well, so like torch beams in Jurassic Park.
Looks so cinematic.
They won't show up, a torch beam will not
but
show
you can
up
see it
without any haze or mist. And the other most important reason for turbidity in cinema scenes and some photography scenes is the effect of contrast. And this is really important because the next part we're going to talk about is turbidity builds up over distance, of course, right? So the further away something is, then the more turbidity it's in, because there's more fog in front of it.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say depth was going to be the...
Yeah, so it's a depth thing. It's a three-dimensional thing. So if your subject is at the front of your scene, it's higher contrast. Let's say they're both wearing black jackets. The one at the front will look more black than the one at the back, which will look more, because it's got more smokiness in front of them. So you can separate subjects by using turbidity. There was a famous painter, I can't remember his name now, Albert someone, an American painter who painted scenes of valleys and nature in America and canyons, and he used turbidity to really, really good effect in his scenes, of fantastic use of light and turbidity. Turbidity is essentially a contrast tool, and contrast is the next topic I want to talk about. One of the interesting things in our visual systems, one of the most powerful things in photography, is the use of contrast. So, for example, when a viewer looks at an image, if there's a face in the image, they'll immediately be drawn to the face and the eyes, because that's human survival instinct to decide whether the face is friend or foe. If there is no face in the image, and it's an image of a car, a product, a still life, whatever, their eye will go to the highest point of contrast. So what does that mean? The highest point of contrast is the area where there's the biggest disparity between a dark and a bright tone, okay? So black laying over white would be the highest point of contrast, but generally speaking, it might be that you've got a dark edge against a lightish background, or a bright white edge against a darkish background. Your eye will immediately go to that point.
Is there a biological reason for that?
Yes, there is, and I'm going to explain what that is in a second. Thank you for bringing that up.
This is like a lesson. It's brilliant. I love it.
So we're drawn to that particular point of high contrast, and you can use that in your photography deliberately, and I use it deliberately, so that you can lead people into a picture the way you want their eye to go. So I often use higher contrast areas in the lower left part to lead them into the picture, then get them to circulate around the image. Now, that use of high contrast is also impacted by the angle of the contrast. So if the angle of the contrast is a diagonal line, we respond more responsively to that than we do if it was a horizontal line. And the reason for that is to do with neuroscience, and that's just that our the cells in our vision systems are programmed to find diagonal lines more clearly than horizontal lines. They react more to it.
I guess that's what you'd see as more dynamic or high dynamic
image. High dynamics. Now, the reason you said about is there a survival or evolutionary reason for contrast? And the answer is yes. It's to do, though, more with the motion. Anything in your visual system, when you're walking along through the long grasses, worried about, we're going back to caveman times, we're wandering through the savannah, through the long grasses, the most likely chance to your survival is if you notice change. Because if something changes in the scene, something is happening. So a tiger or a saber-toothed tiger or a lion coming out of that long grass from the lower left corner out of your peripheral vision is a major threat to your survival. If it's coming from the front of you, which it wouldn't because it knows you're going to more likely see it, but what you've noticed in the peripheral vision is change. And contrast is equivalent to change in an image. So when we have animals and systems that use camouflage, they basically amalgamate themselves into the scene by not having change to the scene. But as soon as something changes, it's a change in contrast, and that change in contrast is the giveaway that something is happening. And that's why our visual systems are so strongly programmed to it, and quite possibly why diagonally it's more powerful.
Because there you're breaking the horizon,
yes,
which is
exactly.
horizontal, isn't it?
Yeah,
So.
and it could be that, or the fact that if it's coming in from lower left or lower right, it's coming in at a diagonal angle. It's not likely to come in directly horizontally at you. It's to jump from a cliff edge above you down, or come up at you from below. And therefore, we've got very much more tuned into diagonal contrast as well. And it all goes to our evolutionary system vision.
Who knew that the way you photograph something would relate to how you were getting attacked when you were
it's incredible, isn't it? It's absolutely
a Black Panther
incredible.
in the snow is not going to eat many humans.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that's one of the key reasons on contrast. And we use contrast in photography for all sorts of situations. And one great example of it is black and white photography. There is no color there. We are only dealing with luminosity values. That's brightness values from 0, black, to 255 in pure white, and every tone in between. And we can perfectly decipher the world around us. As a matter of fact, some of you may remember, there may be listeners that remember, but back in the 40s, 50s, there was only black and white television. So we used to quite comfortably watch black and white television. We watched black and white films, even Schindler's List wasn't that long ago, was a black and white film, even in a modern era. We will accept black and white films because contrast is there, tonal range, luminosity is there. We don't need color to survive. It's evolved as a tool that helps us survive, helps us decide whether we can pick that fruit or those berries, which ones might be poisonous or which animal might be poisonous. But we could actually survive. If I took away your colour vision now, Emma, you could get about the world no problem, just on luminosity and contrast.
A really interesting video the other day, I can't remember who it was, and it was talking about it was about makeup and the makeup that they used in old black and white films. And I think it was that they used to paint the lips green or something, because that showed as red when it translated to black and white. It's really interesting.
You use reds and yellow filters, don't you, to
on top
change
of black
the
and white
contrast.
Film. Yeah.
But when you're printing in a dark room in the old days, you could change the contrast of the image.
That's
with the
right.
Colours.
So yes, certain colours will record at different luminosity values on black and white film or different black and white sensors, etc., or different black and white recording materials. And therefore, as Emma's pointed out, sometimes they would use almost ridiculous colours of makeup because ultimately the black and white medium that it was recorded on was going to record at a different level. And what Tim's talking about is the use of colour filtration on the front of the lens, even though you're recording in black and white. And that's because if you put a red filter on top, you're cutting out cyan light. Therefore, for example, you can make the sky look blacker and the clouds punch out more in the landscape scene. Exactly, Ansel Adams style. And photographers in the black and white era, we used to use anything from green, yellow, orange and red filters to give slightly different feelings.
I mean, interestingly as well, when you paint, there's a thing with paint, like the luminosity is almost like the chroma value of the colour and the pigment, because all paints are made up of a pigment that might be something that's been basically ground down that's of that colour, whether it's synthetic or natural, like a rock or an earth that's been ground to make that brown, and then it's bound with a binder like linseed oil for oils or gum arabic like for watercolours or that. But it's not always possible to have the exact colour that you've got in nature. Like some flowers are brighter in chroma value than you can actually get a pigment to record it. So the way you get around that is to use contrast in your painting. Like a really bright yellow daffodil or something, or a daisy or something, there might not be the colour that you've got, or the colour that you've got available anyway in your set of paints. So the way you can get around that is to kind of replicate light and have contrast. So you could paint that yellow in a lighter, more whiter yellow, paler yellow, against a really nice dark kind of Payne's grey, like a deep bluey grey, really dark, almost black, and then offset that against the brighter, lighter yellow, and give that illusion. Yes, you get the illusion that you've got this really vibrant colour that might be even brighter than you've got in a tube of paint in your set of paint.
And again, that comes down to the science of how our visual systems work, because colour and how we perceive colour is actually heavily influenced by surrounding colour as well. So if you were to take the colour magenta, a square of magenta, and you had it on a page that was green, and then you put the same magenta square on a page that was white, they would look very different, the two magentas, because we are adapting our color systems based on the surrounding influencing environment as well.
And like the Impressionist paint artists are really key to that. If you look at them, it's all small brush marks of colours, like Claude Monet's series, the water lilies. Everyone would have heard of
that's
that.
A fantastic one.
They're just, and we had Renoir, went to a Renoir exhibition as well recently, another Impressionist, and it's very interesting. I was chatting to the curator of the show, and he said, like, you got to remember as well, people at this time when they were painting, there was no film available. Well, I think film was just coming in about when the Impressionists were around, because they were worried then that photography was going to take over from art as a kind of viable business. But they're painting something aimed to be put on the wall that you're going to be viewing from probably about 6-7 feet away, like sat on the chair in your living room with it on the wall, like where your TV would be nowadays. Back then, as an enjoyment to sit there and look at this view or this scene or the depiction of something, a story. And there they're using, very cleverly using marks of colour that when you're really close to it, almost just looks a blur of colour and marks and like dappled colours and patterns. But when you get back from it, 6-7 foot away, it all kind of comes into focus, and the play of the colours that they've used and the marks of blues and greens and yellows sort of alongside each other. Like you can put blue and green and yellow next to each other just in marks and kind of visually create green without even mixing them, like sort of more of a pointillist.
You mentioned Monet. He did a painting. Was it the Bath of the Frogs? I can't remember the French name of it, but it was a depiction of a water scene and people in France using a bathing pool, and he used a very specific blue, yellow, and black in a particular pattern. And the science of that is that actually causes a shimmering effect, and it made the water look very realistic and moving. But what I really find fascinating about it is that they didn't actually know the science behind it then. They just did it instinctively. And
but I think you, as an artist, you kind of play, I know I do, I play and kind of experiment with colours, like in a sketchbook, or on quite often before I do a painting, I might do several small little, really quick, maybe even like 2 minute or less, 30-second little sketches in colours. So I want to play with the mood and feel that I want to get from that image. And what I don't like to use an unlimited palette of colours. I like to restrict myself to a handful of colours because it gives a nice feel to the paint. There's a kind of a colour hue, like a nice vibe to the image if it's got a limited palette. Almost same with like a lot of movies and that, they're kind of colour corrected, aren't they? They go through post-production, so that colour hue of the movie,
like the Matrix, green.
It has got thousands of colours in it, but it's kind of got a general, like the Matrix.
Like Wes Anderson type stuff as well. It's just like a very...
It's like a flat
It's like a pastel palette, isn't it?
Yeah, so that palette can be used in anything, like in design. It's used, and there's actually books like fashion houses try and forecast what's going to be the and kind of household paint manufacturers what's going to be the in colour next season, and the fashion. So that's really key to moving on a bit from the French Impressionists, but there's like a science behind that now. And people make money just out of trying to forecast and guess what's going to be the cool colour next year, and what clothes are people going to want, black or blue is the new black kind of thing that was out a few years ago, or is it going to be colourful or greys and more muted kind of themes? And it's about thinking about how you can also creatively use that in your work and your kind of style.
They used the green to show that they were in the Matrix, that was the sort of symbolism. Or
yes, and then when they weren't in the Matrix, it was normal colour.
I mean, Stranger Things is a series that is very... I think they've used lighting because they've got the upside down world there, like red. And that's all kind of also lit from below a lot of it, isn't it? So it gets the feel that's down.
Uncanny.
But it's got that weird light, and almost some of the light is almost some of the spectrum's missing. Like when you're in the, I can't remember. It's been a while since I've watched it.
The upside down.
Yeah, the upside down. Yeah. But you get the light is very important in that to give them the feel and the vibe and the atmosphere, isn't it? The movie. So.
Okay, well, we're coming to the end of this. We're just going to wrap this up with observation. I think you touched on this earlier, Emma, about observing the world when you're out and about, and I think this is absolutely key. I know Tim does it. I know I've done it for years. If you want to improve your ability to see light and understand light, you've got to really look at it and really study it. So in any situation where you're outdoors, sat in a cafe, look at the light refracting through the glass, the caustics that are being cast. Look at the resonance of lighting on different surfaces and materials, diffusion, colour and shadows, dappled light, hard light, soft light, density of shadows. That means the darkness of the shadows or the brightness of the shadows. Then the definition of the shadows, the edge of the shadows, how sharp they are. Take all of that information in every time of day, in every different situation, and familiarize yourself with it so that you it becomes instinctive. And then figure out how you can use tools in a studio environment or on set to replicate that, or light in a certain way to create these emotions. And using those tools is obviously a skill set in itself. But before you can use the tools, you need to understand the purpose of them and what they're for. There's no point having like 100 different lighting modifiers of different shapes and sizes if you've got no idea really what they're meant for or what they're meant to do. And you can only really know what they're meant to do when you've observed situations in the world around you or different scenes. And actually watching films is one of the great ways of understanding lighting. As Ben said earlier, a great film doesn't have just a good story and good actors, it's got to have good lighting as well. And if you watch the very best films and observe the lighting in them, and often lighting, you can talk of lighting in a broader context. And I often say to clients, what sort of mood do you want? Do you want joyful, happy, sexy, fun, bright, dark, ominous, edgy, dynamic? And you can use all of those mood board words, and those words in themselves can depict the lighting.
Because I suppose your client doesn't know, I want a hard light or I want this light.
No.
They just want to make it creepy or to make
exactly.
it
they'll understand those words,
but they don't know what that means, and that's your job as a photographer or as an artist or as a creative to do that, isn't it?
And then I save kind of mood boards like in a kind of folder, or like I also use a sketchbook regularly to kind of just jot down even sometimes just a written note of something that caught my eye or an idea that came in, and that's a good resource for a toolbook, especially you might not use it for weeks or a year or so, do you know what I mean? But a client or a particular project might come to mind and you think, actually, that kind of thing where I saw the light was really beautiful on those buildings, and like the play and the pattern, that can be really important and be used in a project.
Yeah,
I remember you doing that, Carl. Once we were all out for dinner, I think, and I had a coffee. And you were like, don't touch that coffee. And you started taking a photo of it. This was years ago when I first started working here. I was like, what is he doing?
There must have been something happening with the lights.
And you were like, oh, something about the window and the way it hit it. And you're like, I just want this for reference. And
I mean, you get some really unusual lighting situations in city environments because you get glass buildings that are bouncing direct sunlight back into shadows, and there's shadows but with direct reflected sunlight. For example, sunlight can do really weird things off of black gloss surfaces. But anyway, we're going off on there. One of the key things to just remember is that it's a never-ending journey learning light. Study it, look at it, learn it. We've got tons and tons of great material on light on our platform, some free resources as well, like our lighting modifier comparison tool, but tons of resources in understanding and learning light to a greater level.
We've got a lot of like visual representations of what you were basically describing throughout this podcast, haven't we? So
yes,
it's definitely worth having a
one of my favourites that I teach and try to teach as many people as possible is global illumination and how we can change shadow density, because you can have shadows and people think of shadows as a sharp shadow or a soft shadow, but they never think about how dense the shadow is. So whether it's black or how much illumination is in the shadow. You can bring a really, really sharp edge shadow to actually quite light. So it's almost invisible, but it's still a very sharp edge shadow. And that can create a completely different mood and feeling in the subject as well. But anyway, that's enough. We're over an hour now, aren't we, I think?
Yeah, we must be.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Thanks, guys. Hope you enjoyed the Learn, Create, Thrive podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
This was the Learn, Create, Thrive podcast, hosted by visualeducation.com.